forest consumed them, one after the other, as the moon bled its pale glow through the gnarled skeletal branches. Bare feet sank silently into the damp earth, moving with quiet certainty, pulled by an invisible pull. The air was thick with the stench of rot and a sickly sweet undertone, something patiently waiting. Shadows flitted between the trees, forms twisting in the murky haze. At the center of the clearing, a fire burned low, its embers pulsing like a fading heartbeat. No words were spoken, none were needed. The ritual was set, the time had arrived. Darkness, damp earth, the scent of decay and something sweet, something rich like roasted meat and overripe fruit. He opened his eyes, blinking against the shadows that pressed in around him. Trees loomed above, gnarled and ancient, their twisted limbs blocking out the moonlight. A cold wind slithered through the forest, whispering through brittle leaves. He did not know how he had come to be here. He did not know who he was. Panic coiled in his gut, but before it could take hold, a sound drifted through the trees. The murmur of voices, the clink of goblets, the crackling of fire. It beckoned him, warm and inviting, cutting through the cold emptiness in his mind. Drawn forward, he stepped over roots and fallen branches, his bare feet silent against the forest floor. The trees parted suddenly, revealing a great wooden table stretching long and wide beneath a canopy of night. Dozens of figures sat around it, their faces obscured by dark hoods. Candles flickered in iron candelabras, their flames reflecting in silver platters piled high with glistening meats, steaming bread, and fruits that dripped with juice. Goblets brimming with deep red wine stood at every place setting, and the scent of it all, rich, intoxicating, made his stomach tighten with hunger. As he hesitated at the edge of the clearing, one of the robed figures turned to him. Though their face remained hidden beneath their hood, their voice was warm, familiar. "Come, honored guest, you are expected." Something inside him shuddered at those words. He wanted to protest, to ask who he was, why he was here, but his throat felt tight, his tongue heavy. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him toward an empty seat at the head of the table. The robed figure shifted as one, a silent acknowledgement, a welcome. He sat. Before him, a golden plate gleamed, empty. A single goblet waited beside it, filled to the brim with dark wine. The figure beside him lifted a silver spoon and gestured toward the table. "Eat, the feast is yours." His hand trembled as he reached out. He tore a piece of bread and brought it to his lips. The moment it touched his tongue, his mind shuddered. A vision, flashes of movement, of blood, of steel slicing through flesh, a scream cut short. He gasped, dropping the bread. His hands shook. "What?" His voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. "What is this?" The robed figure beside him chuckled softly. "Memory." He swallowed, his heart pounding. "I don't understand." The figure picked up a goblet and swirled the wine inside. "You will." Against his better judgment, he took another bite. More memories surfaced, faces, expressions twisted in fear, hands reaching out, pleading. His own hands gripping a blade, the weight of steel, the warmth of blood. His breath came in shallow gasps. He looked around the table, his vision swimming. The feast continued as if nothing had happened, as if the others did not notice his horror. But of course, they did. They were waiting. The figure beside him leaned in. "It is always like this," they said softly. "Each time the pieces return slowly, and you struggle to understand. But in the end you remember, and then you must choose." He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. "Choose?" The figure lifted the goblet before him. "To remember and carry the weight of what you have done, or to forget once more. To drink and be free." He stared at the goblet. The wine inside was dark, almost black in the candlelight. It smelled of spices and something deeper, something older than time itself. His mind reeled. The memories were clearer now, each piece sliding into place with horrifying clarity. The faces of those he had wronged, the bodies left in his wake, the choices made in the pursuit of power, of greed, of vengeance. His name, was on the tip of his tongue, waiting to be reclaimed. But the weight of it, oh, the weight, his hands clenched into fists. He did not want to bear it. The figure beside him spoke again, their voice gentle, patient. This is not the first time you have sat at this table. Not the first time you have chosen. You have been given the chance to remember. And each time, you have let it go. His gaze flickered to them, his breath shallow. Why? The figure exhaled. Because knowledge is pain, and some souls would rather be lost than suffer beneath it. The goblet gleamed before him. His heartbeat roared in his ears. He thought of the past, the horror of it. He thought of the future, the weight of what he had done pressing down upon him, never to be lifted. He could not carry it. He had never been able to. With a shaking hand, he lifted the goblet to his lips. The wine was thick, sweet, warm as it slid down his throat. A numbness spread through him, a veil drawing over his mind, blurring the edges of memory. The names, the faces, the guilt, all of it faded, slipping through his grasp like smoke on the wind. He set the goblet down, exhaling. The weight was gone. The burden lifted. He was free. The figure beside him nodded in solemn understanding. So it is chosen. The candlelight flickered. The feast stretched long into the night, the voices warm and welcoming. The forest swayed in the wind, and above them, the sky turned ever darker. And somewhere, deep in the forgotten recesses of his mind, a past self wept, knowing that the cycle would begin again. Darkness, damp earth, the scent of decay, and something sweet, something rich like roasted meat and overripe fruit. He opened his eyes. The fire crackled, the hooded figures watching him with silent reverence. But now, something was different. A figure at the far end of the table, face shadowed, did not partake of the feast. They sat still, waiting, watching him with an intensity that unsettled him. A whisper crawled through his mind. Break the cycle. Remember. His fingers twitched. The choice had always been his, but had he ever truly had the strength to make it? The forest swallowed them whole, one by one, as the moon bled pale light through the skeletal branches. Bare feet pressed into the damp earth, silent but sure, drawn by an unseen force. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something sickly sweet, something waiting. Shadows flickered beyond the trees, shapes shifting in the gloom. A fire smoldered at the heart of the clearing, its embers pulsing like a dying heartbeat. No one spoke, no one needed to. The feast was prepared, the hour had come, and in the darkness someone was watching. The night smelled of damp leaves and something richer underneath, spiced wine, roasting meat, the distant promise of decay. Firelight flickered between the skeletal trees, casting long, wavering shadows against the gathered figures, all draped in dark robes. At the center of it all, the feast was laid upon a table of gnarled wood, heavy with meats glistening in the fire's glow, bread torn into jagged pieces, goblets filled to the brim with something deep and red. A woman stood at the edge of the gathering, uncertain. Her head was heavy, her mind sluggish, as though she had just woken from a long sleep. Her clothes were simple, a gray tunic, bare feet muddied by the forest floor. She tried to recall how she had gotten here, but her thoughts slipped away like smoke through her fingers. A voice beside her, low, measured, careful. "Do you know your name?" She turned. A man stood close, his face shadowed by the hood of his robe. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't place why. "No," she admitted. The word felt foreign on her tongue. "That's expected." His lips curved slightly. "You are the guest tonight." A murmur passed through the gathered figures. Some watched her, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. Others spoke in hushed tones, their voices slithering through the night air. "The guest," she echoed. "You were chosen." He gestured toward the table. "Come, eat." The woman hesitated, but hunger gnawed at her. Her legs carried her forward before she made the choice herself. She sat among them, the fire warming her skin, though a deeper chill remained in her bones. Goblets were raised. A woman across from her, pale and thin as a wisp of smoke, grinned. "To the Nameless." "To the Nameless," the others echoed. The woman did not drink, not yet. She studied the figures around her, searching for something, some tether to the past she could not recall. "Who are you?" she asked finally. The man beside her refilled her cup, his hand steady. "We are those who remember," he said, "and those who choose to forget." Something in the way he said it made her uneasy. She picked at the food on her plate, but the first bite sent a shock through her. Not because it tasted wrong, it was rich and tender, seasoned perfectly, but because the moment it touched her tongue, something stirred in her mind. A memory, faint, a dark room, the scent of iron, a scream, choked off too soon. She dropped her fork. A hand settled on her wrist, gentle, firm, the man beside her. "It comes back in pieces," he murmured. "You will remember soon." The others watched her with quiet expectation. There was something hungry in their eyes that unsettled her more than the feast itself. The pale woman across from her leaned forward. "What do you recall?" She swallowed hard. "Nothing." The woman laughed. Liar. The words slithered under her skin. Her breath grew short, her pulse quickening. "Why am I here?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. A moment of silence. Then, the man beside her spoke again, softly. "You have been here before." She shook her head. "No, that's not possible." Another memory surfaced. An alley, slick with rain, a knife gripped tight in her hand, a body slumping to the ground, warmth spilling over her fingers. She gasped, shoving back from the table. The goblet tipped, spilling wine or something like it across the wood. The fire crackled, but the gathering remained still. The man did not look surprised. "You see now?" Her chest heaved. I didn't." The pale woman's grin widened. "Didn't what?" "I don't remember," she snapped, though it was a lie. The memories were unraveling now, spilling forth too fast to stop. The taste of blood, the weight of a body against hers, the heat of anger fading into something worse. A choice, made again and again. She had been here before. The man beside her stood. The others followed. The air grew thick, suffocating, charged with something unseen. "This is the feast of the Nameless," he said. "Each year we gather. Each year one among us is chosen to forget." She backed away, stumbling. "Chosen. To atone," the pale woman murmured. "To be reborn." Her pulse thundered. "I don't understand." The man's voice remained calm, measured. "You have done terrible things." She shook her head, but the truth was there now, undeniable. She saw herself in flashes, knife in hand, whispered promises, broken bodies left behind. She had thought she could live with it, and yet she had come here, just as she had before. "You chose to forget," the man said, "and now you must choose again." She looked around, at the feast, the flickering fire, the eyes that held nothing but patience, expectation. Her own voice from a memory long buried. "Make me forget, please." A sob rose in her throat. "I don't want to remember." The pale woman extended a hand. "Then drink." The goblet lay overturned, its contents dark against the wood. Another was placed before her, full once more. The scent of it was rich, intoxicating, the promise of oblivion. She could walk away. She could flee into the woods, take her chances in the darkness, but the memories would follow, the weight of them, unbearable. She reached for the cup. The man watched her, his expression unreadable. "You will return," he said softly. "You always do." The taste of it was sweet and thick, coating her tongue. The world wavered at the edges, darkening. A final thought before everything slipped away. She had chosen this, and she would choose it again, and again, and again. Somewhere in the distance beyond the firelight, an owl called. The sound was lonely, hollow, the last thing she heard before darkness took her. When she woke, she would remember nothing. The feast would begin anew, and she would be among them once more. The cycle continued, an endless tide of forgotten sins and chosen amnesia, each year blending into the next. And deep down, in the space where her soul might have been, she knew she would never escape. One by one they vanished into the forest's embrace, the moon's feeble glow threading through a tangle of skeletal limbs overhead. The ground, cool and slick beneath their bare feet, guided them forward, pulled by a force neither seen nor questioned. The air carried a cloying blend of rot and something disturbingly sweet, a scent that clung to the throat. Beyond the trees, shadows slithered, restless and shifting. At the clearing's core, a fire smoldered, its embers pulsing like breath too shallow to sustain life. No words were spoken, none were necessary. The offering lay ready, the appointed time had come, and in the consuming dark, unseen eyes lingered. She awoke to the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest around her pulsed with an unnatural stillness, the trees looming like silent sentinels against the void of the night sky. She did not know her name, nor how she had come to lie in the gnarled roots of an ancient oak. Her limbs were stiff with cold, her skin damp with the breath of the woods. A sound beckoned her, a whisper of movement, a rustling of robes, a head through the shifting mist. A glow flickered like dying embers. Drawn forward by an invisible thread, she stumbled toward the light. The path twisted and curled, the trees pressing close as if urging her onward. She emerged into a clearing where a long, gnarled table stretched before her. Candles flickered in iron holders, their flames burning too still in the stagnant air. The table groaned beneath a feast of glistening meats, overripe fruit, and goblets of wine so dark it could have been blood. Around it, figures sat, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. None turned to her, yet she felt their attention coil around her like a noose. A man seated beside an empty chair finally spoke. His voice was smooth, practiced, laced with something she could not name. "You've arrived at last." She stared at him, trying to form words, but her throat was dry, her thoughts a tangled mass of questions. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Sit. You are the honored guest." The others did not speak, did not move, but the weight of their presence pressed upon her. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered herself onto the chair. The wood creaked beneath her, as though something ancient inside it had awoken. Plates were filled before her, and her stomach clenched with an unfamiliar hunger. She did not remember when she had last eaten. She picked up a piece of dark meat, its juices running thick down her fingers, and bit into it. It was rich, almost too much so, and yet she could not stop. The more she ate, the more something inside her stirred. A flash. Blood on her hands, a scream choked short. The weight of a blade in her grasp. She dropped the fork with a clatter, her breath ragged. The man beside her regarded her with something close to amusement. "The memories will come," he said. "They always do." She turned to him, her voice finally finding purchase. "Who am I?" He reached for his own goblet, taking a measured sip. "Does it matter?" She swallowed. "I don't remember anything." "You are fortunate, then." The words unsettled her. She looked down at her hands, saw the faintest ghost of something staining her nails, something red. Another memory surfaced. A darkened room, a voice pleading, her own voice whispering words of finality, a sharp cry, then silence. The coppery scent of blood in the air. She jerked away from the table, stumbling to her feet. "I need to leave." The hooded figures did not move. The man beside her merely sighed, setting his goblet down with a soft clink. "You always say that," he murmured. She blinked. "What?" "You always run, and yet you always return. It is the way of things." Her mind reeled. "No, I don't understand." He gestured to the center of the table, where a single ornate goblet rested, its surface etched with symbols she could not comprehend. This is the choice you must make. Drink and you will be free of these memories. You will begin again as you have before. Or remember and bear the weight of what you have done. She could feel the stares of the figures around her, though none spoke. The forest itself seemed to hush, waiting. She stepped backward, her pulse hammering in her throat. I don't want this. But you chose it before, again and again. No, her voice was barely a whisper. His gaze was unyielding. Then run, if you must, but you will find your way back. She turned and fled, the trees closing in behind her, their skeletal limbs reaching. The night swallowed her, but the echoes of their silence chased her deeper into the woods. She did not know how far she ran, nor for how long, but eventually the breath tore from her lungs and she collapsed against a crumbling tree trunk. The world spun, her memories a storm within her mind. She saw their faces now, the ones she had taken, the people who had begged, the ones who had cursed her name before she silenced them. The blade in her hand, the smile on her lips. The realization was a sickness, curling deep in her gut. She was a monster. A rustling sound made her jerk her head up. The hooded figures were there, standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. You cannot outrun what you are, the man's voice whispered through the air. Tears burned hot down her cheeks. She had done terrible things, and she had chosen to forget. Not this time. She screamed, a wretched, broken sound, and turned to flee once more. The forest twisted, the trees unfamiliar, the path always leading back to the clearing. The table still stood, the feast untouched, the goblet waiting. The man watched her with something like pity. There is no other path, he murmured. She fell to her knees, her body racked with sobs. She could not live with this knowledge. She could not live with herself. Her fingers closed around a shard of broken glass from the table, sharp and glistening. The figures did not move as she pressed it to her throat. The man sighed, almost weary. You will return. Darkness swallowed her whole. And somewhere, deep in the roots of the forest, beneath the loam and bones of forgotten souls, something shifted. The cycle had not ended. It had only begun again. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.